Hi, and welcome to Writer's Ramble. I'm Deanna.
And I'm Michael.
And today we're going to be discussing Midnight Sun. I feel like I'm the only person on Earth that happens to like Twilight. What about you, Michael?
Nah.
But unfortunately for you, you married me, so you get to...
So we're here now.
Yep. Anyways, so I just want to say, I do realize that the Twilight saga in general has problems. Like, I can definitely recognize that for sure. It's kind of a guilty pleasure for me, and it's a story that takes me back to when I was, like, in middle school. It was just what got me through those rough middle school days, so...
It's also, like, one of the first series you read that was, like, romance-specific. And it's kind of, like, what got you into reading in the first place, because the other ones just weren't catching your interest in the same way, because they weren't mainly romance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, weirdly enough, no romances for children books.
I mean, there are, but they're usually not that passionate and in-depth and deep or whatever.
Yeah. It would be kind of weird, not gonna lie. But anyways, so that's why I got into Twilight. It was, romance, and I was like, wow, there's books that have romance. Awesome. It's perfect for me. With that said, there's plenty of problems with the romance, I'm not gonna lie. Like, all the characters, like, now that I'm older and kind of, like, going through the series again for, like, the first time in, I think, like, 12 years, it's an interesting experience rereading them because I realize all the characters all have all sorts of problems, but something you could say, kind of a positive to have with your writing is, like, make sure your characters aren't, like, Mary Sue's that don't have any flaws at all. Like, these guys got all sorts of problems.
And while Bella isn't really like Mary Sue per se, she is like not like other girls kind of girl, and is very quirky and different, and as such is kind of like given special treatment like she is a Mary Sue or something. I mean like in a romance, if everybody likes you, if everybody is romantically attracted to you, then that kind of makes you overpowered in a romance setting.
Which there actually is, like, an explanation for that, because I've heard a lot of people complain, all the guys in Twilight are all, like, wanting to be with Bella, which, like, feels unrealistic, but there is a explanation for that. And I know you're not too happy about it, but we will get there in a little bit.
It's one I have issue with, but let's continue.
So naturally, I've read Midnight Sun. Michael hasn't. In your case, you haven't read any of the books. So I just kind of tortured you by making you watch the movies at one point.
Yeah, I have seen all the movies, which is where all of my criticism is going to come from. So anyone who has a complaint that's book specific, I'm not complaining about the books. For all I know or care, they're perfect, so don't come at me because of the books.
So for those who don't know, Midnight Sun is a retelling of Twilight. It's just through Edward's perspectives, but it's the same plot more or less. You get a few, like, additional scenes that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise through Bella's perspective.
One thing that I find crazy about it is at one point you had looked up like how long each of them were, and Twilight itself is on the shorter end for Stephanie Meyer. Like, I want to say 90,000 words or something like that.
I forget the number of
and
words.
Midnight Sun is like triple that or something like that, like 180,000 words or maybe even 200,000. And I just don't know how it can be the same story and somehow like feel like the same story, be the literal same story through a different perspective, and be like tripled the length. I don't know how she did it.
I'll include the word count so that viewers know what it was in this case, because off the top of our head we don't quite remember, but it is pretty crazy just how much bigger Midnight Sun actually is in comparison. I guess it kind of makes sense just because we do get some of those additional scenes through Edward's perspective.
Well, how many?
It's a few extra scenes, but another thing I want to mention is that I think like the difference in word count, a lot of it boils down to also just Stephanie Meyer's writing style changing, and I think it could also be that we just are inside Edward's head more because it's from his perspective, and so we're just seeing more of like his internal thoughts and whatnot. Just more wordy in that case, I would say. Like, I feel like New Moon feels more simplistic. Like, the editor really went and, like, just probably pulled out a lot of sentences that maybe weren't necessary. And I'm not saying there's unnecessary sentences in Midnight Sun, but it just feels a little wordier, at least to me. And so Midnight Sun back in the day was originally scheduled to release in 2008 roughly, and it wasn't released until like 2020, as it turns out, because back in the day, it ended up being that Midnight Sun was actually leaked. And it wasn't just like a little bit of it was leaked. The first 12 chapters were actually leaked like onto the internet. And Stephanie Meyer lost her motivation to continue for quite a while, and I kind of don't blame her, because, like...
Yeah, it's pretty demoralizing.
Yeah. And because it was on the internet, I happened to be one of the gremlins who did read what was available at the time.
Wasn't it because your mom found it?
Yeah. I'm not trying to call out my mom at all. I love you, Mom. I mean, I feel like a lot of fans did do it back in the day. It's not right.
I mean, it's not like you're the one that leaked it.
I know.
So.
But it's not good necessarily. Like, I would feel bad if I were Stephanie Meyer, like, oh, all these people are just reading like half of the book for free. Awesome. But, you know,
I guess I'm more nonchalant. I mean, you know, as an author, I wouldn't want people to just read all my stuff for free either. I get that, but at the same time, it's like, well, I mean, it's not their fault for being curious, and if anything, it's a little bit of a compliment because they want to know what you wrote.
Yeah, and I mean, in the case where, like, we found out that she decided to stop writing it, it was kind of like, you know, at that point, it's like, you might as well read what we're able to read, which just doesn't exactly help either, but, you know, I was, like, 11, 12, and wanted to read more. I actually did a book report on it in my class, and it was allowed because my English teacher was actually also like a diehard Twilight fan, so she was like stoked to hear me cover it. So
well, you got lucky.
yeah, so Mrs. Evans out there, thank you. And so here's a fun fact. Back in the day when they were filming Twilight, Stephanie Meyer actually did provide a few completed chapters to Robert Pattinson so that he could, you know, better portray Edward while he was acting. And a scene where you see this most, I think, is the classroom scene where, you know, Edward first smells Bella and she's like the tastiest motherfucker he's ever smelled. What I find really interesting is just hearing all of it through Edward's perspective in Midnight Sun, because like that whole time, I mean, he from like what you've described, and you know, it looks like he's smelled like ass.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing. Here's me being a hater, but he smelled like he smelled something really bad, and
you mean,
you know, according to the lore or whatever, it's supposed to be the opposite of that. You know, you'd think he'd like lean forward or something, close his eyes, really like... take it in, or at the very least seem like he wants it instead of... I think I know what he was going for, which is like trying to hold himself back, but it just comes across the opposite it's supposed to be. Like you think, be like, oh yeah, instead.
Yeah,
that's what it sounds. That's what it seems like to me.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I do find that really hilarious. I've seen some people like have a framed picture of him like holding his nose like framed over their toilet, and I think that's really hilarious actually. But actually what I was gonna talk about with that same scene is like once he's like not holding his nose anymore, he's just like glaring daggers into her soul like he wants her to die on the spot.
Yeah, and again it's like, and I know like what he wants to do is kill her essentially, but it's not in a way where he hates her, you know. You don't hate your cheeseburger while you're eating it.
Well, in this case, you know, thanks to Midnight Sun, we were seeing it from his perspective. It was challenging his lifestyle and like being like a vegan vampire or vegan vegetarian vampire. And so he didn't want to, screw everything up and have to, like, in that moment, what he was planning in his head, like, that entire time was, like, how he could, like, snap everyone's neck, like, in that classroom within a matter of, like, seconds so that he could, like, finish her off and, like, drink her blood, drink her blood, and there wouldn't be witnesses. But it was, like, really dark thoughts, and, like, I think the acting that Robert Pattinson had in that scene was pretty good. Just like how he was like staring her down, which is like not normal for any student. Like, she looked scared too, and I don't blame her, because like, what the fuck. And Twilight's not a perfect story by any means. There's been a lot of plot holes, and I think part of it is because it was written all within, like, the entire saga was written within just a few years, kind of rushed.
Which I think, well, I mean, it depends, I guess, on how prolific you are as an author. But I find it kind of interesting how there are several logical plot holes, with the story. Despite the fact that I feel like she goes out of her way in many instances to not have that be the case.
Mm-hmm. And so a positive that I'll say about Midnight Sun is that there are certain plot holes that were at the very least explained, and some of those, like, you don't really care for the explanations. I'm of the mindset where I'm just happy to have an explanation of any kind. Like, a big jarring one for me that was really hard to ignore originally. Before Midnight Sun was released, there was a scene of Bella playing baseball with the Cullens, Edward's family, and eventually there was like a small group of vampires, 3, Laurent, James, and Victoria, that happened to cross by, and it was a big threat because these were normal vampires that would feed off of human blood, and the vampires in the Twilight universe are pretty OP. I'm gonna admit they're very overpowered, and so...
Way too OP in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I always found it weird that James, which was one of the vampires that decided right then that he wanted to, kill Bella, once he smelled her scent and everything and realized that she was a human, I found it really unrealistic that he went as long as he did without realizing that she was a human at first, because, like, they had a conversation and everything with the Cullens wanting to play baseball with them. And normal vampires would be able to hear, like, a human's heartbeat within pretty wide proximity. And so I always found that really unrealistic that they had a whole conversation before he was like, oh, hold up, we got a human here. Like, that doesn't make sense. And what was described in Midnight Sun, I thought it was pretty clever. And so what he did to help disguise Bella's heartbeat, he, like, tapped his foot on the ground, kind of like in a rhythm like a heartbeat, but, like, to throw off James to think, oh, it's just him tapping his foot. And I was like, oh, that's pretty clever, actually. I still think he realized...
Well, actually, who would tap their foot like that? Like, da, 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 da.
I think he was trying to be kind of, like, irregular or something a little bit, so that if you did hear, like, a, like, sound, like...
Okay.
I don't know, just to throw him off. I thought it was clever. It'd be quite a stretch, though, I think, because Bella, she would still smell like a human, and they were going off
and
of...
look like one, right? There's, like, indicators, wasn't there?
Well, it was a cloudy day, so you couldn't see if they were sparkling or anything. So, like, you wouldn't get that indicator.
I thought there was.
Oh, but just kind of going back to, like, her scent, like what I was describing, I think realistically, like, he probably would have smelled her. They were, like, relying on the fact that, like, the wind was, like, blowing the other direction, but, like, with how OP these vampires are, I feel like realistically he probably would have smelled her, but whatever. We'll move on, but...
I mean, like, I saw an episode of Mythbusters once where they were testing how good, like, a bloodhound's nose is, and they did, like, everything you could think of to cover the tracks, including, like, washing the person off several times and spraying, like, specifically, like, smell-canceling stuff all over them, and the bloodhound still found them. I don't know if vampires would be that good, but I think this is just a problem with how OP they are, is it creates problems trying to manage how powerful they are in any realistic sense sometimes without it seeming unrealistic to what has already been established that they can do, among which is like a lot of things you wouldn't expect if you haven't read these books, like walking underwater and not breathing, I guess, and
Yeah, they don't need to breathe.
all sorts of other shit.
I do find it interesting you mentioned the bloodhound because, like, can you imagine if, like, they were, like, these vampires are, like, so OP, but, like, a bloodhound is, like,
It's got a better nose than
has a
them.
better sniffer? That would just be pathetic. So, going by that
I mean, they
logic,
have the best nose in the animal kingdom, to be fair.
better than a vampire.
Like, I just told you the example. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Something that we very briefly touched base on was, you know, Bella being very special in comparison to, like, other humans. You know, we have instances of just a lot of guys wanting to date her. We have where she has special blood and smells, you know, more tasty to the vampires, and everyone wants a piece of her one way or another. I do find it interesting because, like, Midnight Sun does dive into that a little bit, at the very least, with the, like, attraction that people have for her. You know, like, we have, like, various, like, classmates that want to, like, take her to prom or date her or whatever.
It feels like just everybody that she interacts with, no matter what they are, vampire, werewolf, human, they all just kind of are enamored by her, which I always felt like was unrealistic.
But, like, at least with the case of people just, like, being attracted to her, not scent-wise, but in the sense of wanting to date her or be in a relationship, it is kind of explained a little bit. I mean, the obvious one being that she's, like, a new girl at a new school, or new to her school, and in that case, I feel like usually new students do receive more attention, but that's actually not what I'm going to talk about here. But rather,
I mean, I've never experienced that personally, but
yeah, I've seen it. Ironically, I was once a new student. No one gave a shit, but
well, I feel like that's the majority. But because you said this was based on something that she experienced herself when she went to school.
I believe so. I might be wrong about that, but I think it was more based off, like you said, her experience.
So I'm not going to say it can't happen, but I definitely say that's not the norm.
What I will say, though, is that Edward did notice that with Renee, she has almost like, I don't want to say an energy to her, but something about her people are just drawn to. They take her more seriously, or they're charmed by her. She's, like, kind of, like, more charismatic in that sense, and people are just drawn to her, but it's not necessarily the charisma that she has, but rather it's just her as a person. Like, people are just drawn to her for some reason. And Edward found that interesting because he noticed a similar thing with Bella and, you know, like half of the kids in her class wanting to date her. And so it was kind of like chalked up to almost like a genetic thing. And in the Twilight universe, humans may kind of like, you might see little hints of what abilities they may have as a vampire, but just to like a smaller degree as a human, but as a vampire it would be like stronger. So like he kind of was like noticing that.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on a small rant here. I'm gonna try not to get too deep into it just for the sake of time and
spilling the tea.
So I mean, I find issue with the trope in fiction of abilities, or I guess character traits being very inherently biological things. And I know that, you know, to a certain extent that is true in real life, but in a story it tends to, I feel, rob the character of something. A really good character tends to forge their own path, in the sense that readers are going to like or dislike that character based on their own accomplishments. And if that is written off in the story as being based on biological predilection that they got from their parents or grandparents or whatever, then I feel like that no longer feels like their achievement, and I tended to dislike that. And so while it never made sense for Bella to be as popular as she was, this attempted explanation I feel like still isn't the way I would have gone about it. But I'm also not a super best-selling published author, so who am I to speak? But like another clear example of what I'm saying is in Star Wars Rise of Skywalker, where you find out that Rey was Palpatine's granddaughter. And I think there's just like a trend in Star Wars where it's like you always got to be related to somebody interesting or special, otherwise you can't be special. And I think that that's just a good example of what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to get into Star Wars.
I was like, oh no, we're breaking our rule of not talking about Star Wars.
I'm only mentioning, we're going past it now. It's just an example.
Anyways, I am someone that does find like genetics very fascinating, so like I personally don't have too much of an issue with this, but I can see where there's issues with it, or that there could be issues with it. Like the new remake of Mulan, I know has it received a lot of backlash because we do like to see our characters like earn, you know, their skills or, you know, achieve their goals through hard work versus just kind of being handed it, you know.
Yeah, just born with it.
Yeah, so
maybe it's Maybelline.
Yeah. So I understand the criticism there. I did also find it interesting, if we're talking about genetics quickly, with Twilight, I also found it interesting reading through Edward's perspective, trying to read Charlie's thoughts, Bella's dad, because while he can't read Bella's thoughts, he can read Charlie's thoughts, but it's like they're more like muddled. Like it's just harder to like.
Can he read Renee's thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, he can read hers. He can't like. There's something about like on Charlie's side where like it's more difficult to like hear their thoughts. Like he gets a vague idea of like what Charlie's thinking or feeling, but it's almost like a lot of grumbling and kind of like a vague idea of what he's maybe noticing or whatever it may be. It's not like very coherent, clear thoughts for the most part, though.
Contrary to what you might think, I actually don't mind that part so much, even though I just ranted there for a second, because that doesn't necessarily imply anything about her, I guess, skills. The other one, you know, affects her social skills, but this one only specifically affects Edward. And yet again, the only thing I really do truly appreciate about Stephenie Meyer's writing is Charlie.
Everyone loves Charlie, and as I've gotten older and now recently finished New Moon, I especially feel really bad for Charlie, but I'll save that for the New Moon video.
Charlie's a good character, and I don't know why he's in Twilight.
It's for all the people that don't like Twilight. He's the
one sane person.
Yeah. I also just liked being in Edward's head and reading everyone else's thoughts and just kind of seeing what was going on there. I do like that he really likes Angela, which is one of Bella's friends, because she is just like overall like a genuinely really nice person, and he likes to kind of be like nearby her because he's like, oh, someone who's nice.
If only Angela was a character that mattered.
Yeah, I can't really think of.
That's another thing I will say is I don't find a lot of the characters to be necessary to the plot. We were talking about this the other day. I think that it could have, like, the Cullen family could have been like 3 characters and probably still would have managed just fine. Yeah. In my opinion.
That's a thing we could always discuss one day, is like, how many characters do you need? You know, can you weed out some people? Yeah, maybe one day we could talk about that.
Let us know if you'd be interested in a video like that.
For all y'all who love Jessica, because you love, you know...
people like her?
They like Anna Kendrick's, like, acting.
I can understand liking Anna Kendrick.
Yeah. And while I don't blame her for certain things in New Moon, Jessica overall is like a shit friend, guys. Like, you don't want to like her. You've been mistaken. She hates Bella, she's mean, she's jealous, like, she's... the kind of person you wouldn't want to be.
Who's worse, Jessica or Jacob?
Jessica.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Well...
has she done more bad things than Jacob?
I don't know, actually. Once you throw in Renesmee, I feel differently. Yeah, maybe she's okay.
I don't think she's had enough room in the story to do as many bad things. Yeah,
she's mostly just annoying. Jacob is guilty of just being, in my opinion, he would be a very probably abusive, toxic boyfriend / husband or whatever, and I don't want to get into it too much, but as a Twilight fan, I really, 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 really hate what they did with him imprinting on Renesmee that was not necessary, but I'll save that for later. So one gripe that I do have, and I can kind of see where Twilight haters are coming from, because the kind of love story that Edward and Bella have, I mean, it has problems for sure, like what I've mentioned, but it's like they don't have like a whole lot in common. In this case, they're very much like opposites attract trope, which isn't necessarily bad, but like,
It needs to be executed well.
yeah, I do think it is executed better in the books than what you see in the movies. I mean, that's my opinion.
Well, I feel like that leads pretty naturally into another gripe I have, which is that I feel like most of the vampires and certain other characters that are not that important, it always feels like they just don't have anything going on in their lives. They don't have hobbies. They don't have interests. If they're not part of the plot, I don't think they're doing anything. I think they're standing in a corner
T-posing.
in standby mode, going like this. The only thing I can say that they do seem to be pretty good at, and I think maybe they practice if they're not in standby mode, is just like sexy poses, like, because I think it's part of the aesthetic. I understand it's part of the appeal, even for preteen girls, but it's just funny because I don't know. There's several scenes in the movies where they're like at the Cullens' house, and they're like rich and they don't do anything.
Well, what I will say that is talked about with the Cullens, like, at least like Rosalie, because she would on a surface level seem more like a girly girl, very interested in like her looks and, you know, looking pretty, but what I will say is that she actually really likes like working on cars, and they also like to like buy cars all the time, and
Well, and you know, if all of them are big car people, you know, you maybe see them working on them
yeah.
at some point.
Yeah, no, like there was a little bit of that, if I recall correctly, in like Midnight Sun. I think Rosalie was working on something, and I don't know what kind of car it is. I don't know my car breeds, okay, guys? If it runs, that's good enough. But she was like working on her car, and they could have like thrown that into the movie, so you're like, oh wow, they do things, but they didn't, and you know, I think that's also like a valid criticism, because like some characters, I don't know what some of their hobbies are, in all honesty. Like Jasper, I don't know what he does. Like
He stares.
yeah, he stares. And like Esme, you know, she's very warm, motherly, and that's it. Like I don't know what she does on her free time. She, you know, they should have like had her like knit or something. It's like a stereotype.
Yeah, even if it's stereotypical, it's something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she doesn't even like do necessarily like motherly cooking, because they don't need to eat.
Yeah, she doesn't have to look after her kids, because like, who needs looking after when they're like nigh indestructible? The only looking after you'd have to do is like keep them safe from other vampires, and she's not particularly suited for that either.
And then like Carlisle, you know, he's a doctor, so like, you know, at least he has a job.
Yeah, he's got a job.
So like he's a doctor and he's Jesus, like. And what I mean by this, and of course I'm joking, guys, but like has a really clean record. He hasn't like fed off of any humans. You know, while he has changed them, he hasn't like killed any humans to feed off of them or anything like that. And he's just like overall really nice, compassionate guy, and you know, helps kind of like convert other vampires into like onto a better path, a better life, where you're not killing people. You know, they're all vegetarians, and so in that case he's like kind of recruiting like little followers, or you know, a family in this case, but
for a good cause.
Yeah, for a good cause.
I find, I don't want to rant a lot about this, but it's just like the smallest thing that I constantly hear that it like gets my I guess like author grammar Nazi going. They're not vegetarians. I know that's like the best analogy you can think of, but they're not eating vegetables. They're still killing animals. By all like vegan / vegetarian human standards, they are still devils. But it is a good analogy. It's just I had to say, because it bothers me every time. It's like, yeah, but no.
Yes, but actually no.
Yeah.
Anyways, so we accidentally did a little bit of rambling there, but back to my original points with the type of like love story that you do see with Edward and Bella being like opposites attract. While this isn't necessarily a bad trope, I think people have issue with it because, in the sense, especially with the movies, you don't really see them like having like kind of like silly lighthearted conversations about like, oh, what are your interests, what do you like, and like learning more about each other that way. It's more plot driven, like, oh, these are vampires, this is like who the Cullens are and stuff like that.
And the plot is a drama, so they're what you see on screen more often than not, far more often than not, is arguing. So it doesn't look like a good relationship. I personally don't root for them. You probably could have told that by the fact that I don't care for Twilight personally, but
what I will say is like I see where you guys are coming from because it definitely could have been executed better. I do think that the novels cover it better than the movie, which isn't exactly a surprise because usually books are better than the movie. But there are instances where like they have days where they're just like getting to know each other and they're having a lot of fun just like asking each other questions like, oh, what's your favorite movie, what's your favorite artist or favorite kinds of books, and you know, stuff like that. And like I had a lot of fun reading that. Maybe it was probably just like too much to like have in a movie, and they were probably like, okay, we gotta pick up the pace and like get back to like the rest of the plot. But fun fact, Bella actually does have interest in things that she does like that just aren't mentioned in the movies. Like, for instance, she really likes reading. She especially likes like Jane Austen's like classics and other similar stories. One of her favorite movies, actually, is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is actually one of your favorites. Well, I don't know if it's your favorite necessarily. You don't really have favorites.
It's one of my favorite comedies.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And they discussed like music and like what Bella was currently listening to at that time. I think it was like Linkin Park, if I remember correctly.
Why am I not surprised?
It was definitely, you know, of the era.
Well, she also has like a, I don't know, I guess dramatic, edgy, emo edge to her at times, so this feels like it fits.
Yeah. And so for people that say she doesn't have a personality, she does. You just didn't read about it.
Just not a good one. I mean, like...
she has problems, especially after reading New Moon. I am annoyed with certain things, but I'm trying to refrain from going there. But she does have interest in things that she likes. I also liked reading because, like, Edward was interested in knowing, like, you know, where she lived originally, which was Phoenix, Arizona, and he wanted to know, like, what she liked about it, and she went into, like, great detail explaining, like, what it looked like and the things that she did like about it, which probably feels like not necessary, not necessary, but I think it was also just, like, interesting for me to read because, not that I'm gonna say where we live, but I mean, we live in Arizona, so certain things I was like, I know what you're talking about, and, like, it's just, like, if you're watching, like, a crime drama and they mention your, like, city or something, you're like, oh, and they're talking about us. So other things that I liked that were covered in Midnight Sun, I liked, you know, hearing more about, like, Edward's days back when he was hunting humans to, like, you know, weed out people that were, like, rapists and, like, bad people. So, like, that was interesting.
I feel like Stephanie Meyer should have just written a superhero story, because that's what it devolved into by Breaking Dawn.
Yeah, pretty much. And she has admitted they're, like, basically superheroes.
Well, and that's, like, another, like, basic thing I've always found fault with, is, like, I don't feel like vampires are, like, something to strive to be, whereas superheroes always have been. They represent, like, the most ideal people we can be. Think of like Spider-Man or Captain America. But vampires have always been seen as like a curse. And so like she tried to kind of like have her cake and eat it too, and I didn't like it. It's more of a principle thing. I just don't like vampires that being a vampire seems like too cool.
It's like romanticizing something that's bad. Yeah. Oh, I get it. You sound like Edward, though. I'm kidding. Anyways. It It was also interesting to see, just how difficult it was to actually track down James once he was trying to find and hunt Bella. He's weirdly more of a slippery guy than like what we see in Twilight, because we really don't see it in Twilight.
A slippery little snake.
Yeah. And of all things that surprised me, he just ended up just hitching a ride on an airplane as it took off.
You told me about that.
I loved that, honestly. It's like honestly really funny, but like why not?
I'm picturing like the Cullens chasing him to an airport, and then he's like on the runway, and then he gets onto the wheel, and it's like taking off, and the wheel comes in, and he's like, "So long, suckers!" And in the background, it's just like the Benny Hill music playing.
I mean, that's the perfect summary of what was happening.
It feels like those old-timey silent movies where it like was filmed in like fast motion.
And there you have it. I also loved like once Edward, Alice, and I think Emmett. No, wait, not Alice. Wait, no.
Doesn't matter. I mean,
no, I think it was Edward, Alice, Jasper, and Emmett. We're all like, at this point, Bella was a fucking idiot and branched away from Alice and Jasper to like save her mom. In Phoenix, she thought that James had her mom, and so she was trying to rush in and like save her mom. But at this point, Edward and the rest of them they had like this crazy like car ride. I don't want to say a car chase necessarily, but it was just like a really wild like Fast and Furious like scene through like Phoenix, Arizona. And like they like crashed some cars and everything. Like it's hard to explain. And so in this case, they were having to move like by the minute, by the second, as fast as possible to reach Bella before she was like going to be, gruesomely murdered by James. And so, during all of this, like Alice was like in the middle of like seeing different like possibilities and like, when they would be arriving and what they would have to do in order to get there faster. And they had some crazy distractions like crashing some cars, but don't worry, everyone was okay.
This is like
I don't see how realistic
Spider-Man
that
doesn't
is.
kill people levels of like, oh no, technically they're just injured, it's fine.
Yeah, they're just injured.
Well, Batman is a better example.
Yeah. So, they're just injured, don't worry about it. Don't mind the fact that their car is totaled.
There was an explosion. We're assuming they're fine.
Yeah, but what I liked about that scene was that Edward, being a mind reader, he was in the driver's seat, and so he had all the Cullens that were in the car with him to kind of like look outwards, like out the windows, so that he could have like a full 360 like view of everyone around him, so that he could like maneuver around traffic, see if there were like any cops nearby, and at the same time read thoughts. And it was just really insane. It was like, I thought it was a cool visual, and it made Edward look like a total fucking badass straight out of like insert some action movie. I don't watch action movies, I'm sorry guys, but I imagine that's
Fast and Furious.
Yeah. I've never seen a single one.
I've heard enough. That sounds like something that might happen. Minus the mind reading.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's like, that one character that can read all their thoughts. What was painful to read about, though, like at the end of Twilight, or in this case, Midnight Sun, or both, rather, once, Bella's been saved and they're back in Forks, Washington, and like going to prom and all that stuff. Like this whole time, like we see in Midnight Sun through Edward's perspective, he's like planning on like eventually leaving her, because he's like, vampires are too dangerous for her, she should have a normal human life.
And he's right.
Anyways, well, he's like, what I have beef with, because you're allowed to break up with someone if things aren't working out. You don't even necessarily need a good enough reason to break up with someone. Like, you are free to do what you want to do with your life. But what I didn't like was, she was worried of him leaving, and he's like, no, I'm not leaving you. And like in his thoughts, it was like, yet. And it's like, fuck you. That's so manipulative and like lying through a mission, like, fuck you, oh my gosh. Like, I'm Team Edward, but, like, fuck you, Edward.
Why? Why did he say that?
And, like, he was wanting to kind of, like, end things, like, sooner, but he knew that she would, like, fucking lose it. And it was, like, awkward situation. And he's like, let's get her home where she can, like, recover and, like, be in a better state. And then I'll break things off. And so just to kind of conclude this episode, I personally enjoyed reading Midnight Sun and just being able to be inside Edward's head. I do like to see kind of like the behind the scenes, like other things that were happening when Bella wasn't like necessarily around, and like seeing some more backstory stuff. I do feel like Midnight Sun was written better because now I've decided, like, why not reread the rest of the saga, because it's been absolute ages since I've even read it.
I mean, that's why we're doing this right now.
Yeah. But I'm not rereading Twilight because I basically just read Twilight, and so I decided to just jump over to New Moon, and I can definitely tell a difference in the writing, and New Moon feels like more like concise the way it's written, which is a positive for sure, but it also feels like weirdly like kind of like holding the reader's hand in other ways. Like when I was like reading New Moon, it was like describing or kind of like summarizing different things that happened in Twilight, and like maybe like a character would like enter the scene, like maybe Alice, it's like, oh yes, Alice, Edward's adoptive sister who can see the future, or like alternate futures, and it's like, why are you explaining, like we just read Twilight, why are you explaining all of this?
Maybe they started with New Moon.
You're just stupid then. That's your fault. Like, I think even on the back of the books are... Oh, that one doesn't. Usually books will have, like, kind of like a little, like a picture of all the other books, or like titles, so that you're like, oh, I'm reading in the wrong order.
I don't know, like, I can see it having a sort of minimal effect of like, oh, I realize I'm reading this out of order, but like this is giving me enough information that I can just keep going, and then I'll go back to the other one later.
It'd be confusing even then, I feel like. Maybe you feel differently, but I'm of the perspective where I think it can be insulting to kind of like paraphrase things like what I described, you know, explain who Alice is when we've already been introduced to Alice before. I think it's kind of insulting to the readers, like you don't trust that they can follow along and know who these people are. And so if it were me writing it, and maybe this had nothing to do with Stephanie Meyer, like maybe she had like an editor or someone that's like, you should really explain who these people are. Like maybe that's what it was, I have no idea, but if it were me, I would just be like, nope, they know who these people are, and if they don't, they're stupid. And I think overall, I just liked the writing style of Midnight Sun. It was just one that I enjoyed. Maybe you feel differently if you happen to have read Midnight Sun. Let us know, if you happen to be a Twilight fan, what you thought of the differences between like Midnight Sun and the rest of the saga. But do you have anything else that you wanted to add, my lovely husband who adores Twilight?
Number one Twilight fan here. You nailed it. Good job.
Thank you. And so next, not necessarily our next video, but when we do review another story, it's not going to be Twilight, because that's covered, it'll be New Moon. So we will be all part of this fun journey diving into nostalgia lane.
And for everyone else, I hope I managed to keep you engaged with an alternate perspective. And I hope that you tune into the next one as well, if you, at the very least, agree with me.
Yep. So regardless of how you feel about Twilight, you're gonna relate with one of us here.
Just watch our next video as well, please.
I've been Deanna.
And I've been Michael.
And thank you for listening to us ramble about Midnight Sun. Bye!
Have you eaten any vitamin C recently? 'Cause that's how you get scurvy. Bye!
She also, it was mentioned, her favorite movie is Monty Python and the Hoy... and the Hoy Hoy Me Hoy Hoy Hoy.
Me hoy me hoy. There's a pencil I want to like...